In this project we're going to be making another set of shoe toppers and a foam skull using a coating we haven't used before, a UreCoat by Smooth On. I will be giving my opinions later on, but to cut to the long story short, if you want my opinion, it's First off, we're going to show doing the foam, and for the skull we're going to be starting off with a template from Kamui Cosplay. Whenever I'm using someone else's template pattern, I'm always careful to do it properly. When I work on my own, it's always a bit more, yeah, that'll do. But we start off by cutting out the template and laying it roughly out in its final layout. That definitely looks like something sensible and explainable. I really do like these templates because they're very simple and self-explanatory to use. It may look like a complex mishmash of random shapes in an odd jigsaw pattern, but they are very self-explanatory. Part A connecting to part B and so on and so forth. I've used some that don't really explain what you need to do, but these are nice and simple. They tell you on the form which side you need to stick it to and which edges need to be cut straight or at an angle. This is the first side. Now we're cutting out one half of the skull with a nice sharp knife. I've said it before and I'll say it again, you can't ever cut with a sharp enough knife, unless of course it's yourself. Just a note here, when working with a blade it is unfortunately inevitable that you will cut yourself. Accidents happen. Surprisingly, this is another reason why having a sharp blade is better, because a blunt blade has a habit of catching and you tend to have to use more force when pulling the blade through whatever you're cutting, which means that you'll inevitably have less control over the knife. So while it may seem like you want a duller knife so you don't cut yourself as deeply, having a sharper knife will give you more control over where it goes and make it easier to aim for something other than yourself. Once I have cut all the pieces of the foam out, I get my new Dremel and just buff down the edges. This is particularly useful for the sharp curve parts of the pattern, simply because cutting a curve with a straight knife is impossible. You're inevitably going to get imperfections and jumps, imperfect bits, so it's handy to smooth them out. Once they're sanded, I quickly glue them together using contact adhesive. Because there's so many parts to this template, it's easy to glue all the pieces up and then stick them together. Because by the time you've glued up the final piece, the first piece is dry. once I've done the first half, you turn the pattern over and do the other half, making sure to keep the blade as sharp as possible. Can you see the funny bits of foam that I'm drawing the parts on? This is why it saves to be cheap and save all the little bits of foam that you use. Eventually, it's going to be useful. It's going to be just big enough to fit that random bit of foam you want. Be cheap. Always save your foam, even if you've got no room to save it. And keep saying that to yourself while you've got absolutely no room to move around in your workshop. And again, Dremel, Dremel. Oh, sorry. Multi-tool, multi-tool, multi-tool. And of course, always wear a mask. We all know the dangers of microplastics. I also find smoothing the edges with the multi-tool, as well as smoothing them out, it actually gives them a slightly rougher edge, which gives the glue more purchase and making the joins much stronger. You can see me very diligently laying out all the pieces in order. It looks very neat and tidy, doesn't it? Or as neat and tidy as I can get anyway. The template I'm using here is for a wolf skull, but the project is for a pig skull. So what I have to do is kind of reshape it a little, because a wolf skull isn't the same shape as a pig skull. I have to widen the rear and do minor alterations. So while I first make the skull correct to the template, I then start jiggering about with it to get it to look closer to what I think it should be. The pattern gets me close, but there are slight alterations that need to be made to make it closer to a pig skull. For example, I first start off by shortening the snout, because pigs have slightly shorter snouts, but when I also widen the skull, I realised that I didn't need to shorten the snout because the proportions seemed good enough, so I end up remaking the snout the same size. Once I've cut the foam and shaped it to my preference, I then bash it with the multi-tool. Going over all of the edges, all of the joins to hide them, and also changing the general shape of the skull. I work to widen the eyes, reduce the size of the brows, and flatten the top of the head. Also softening any edges that come from the thickness and cut of the foam. I also add a little bit of foam on the inside to simulate the inside of the skull. I soften the orbits around the eyes, and if you see, I do actually have my own little skull that I'm working off of. I then use a craft iron to shape the teeth and gums in the upper and lower jaw. Next, I move on to the shoe toppers. This is for a Dryad costume, and because I've already made this template before, I can just quickly get some foam and cut out the parts. Can you see the difference in professionalism between my templates and the other templates? Don't worry if yours look shockingly terrible. If you're making your own for yourself, as long as they do the job for you, that's fine enough. Unfortunately, the foam that I have isn't big enough for all the pieces, so I end up making one of the pieces out of two parts. Putting all the pieces together, I sand them to be the same size and then contact glue them together and quickly glue them together. Once dry, I cover the foam in contact adhesive and glue on some cylindrical foam inserts. This is to quickly create a bark-like surface for the Dryad's feet, the forest spirit or whatever. Gluing these on is a much easier process than cutting out thousands and thousands and thousands of chads and gluing them on. If you don't know what a chad is, you'll have to have a look at one of my previous videos. We had lots of fun with chads then. Chad. It's pretty quick and easy just to go over the foam. Once we've got the basic outline of the shoe toppers done, I hit them with the heat gun and use some boots of mine to give them a better shape. I then trim off the edges to get them closer to the size I'm looking for, making sure to sand it again. Next, I cut out a load of ivy leaves in 2mm thick foam and begin sticking them randomly onto the shoe toppers. And then making sure that we've got excess foam ready for when the Velcro will be attached. To create the vines, I cut out thin strips of foam from my 2mm thick sheet and then twist them while running them across the table sander. This causes the edges to be sanded, softening them. While it'll never make the bits of foam perfectly round, it does soften the edges so they're not as pronounced. Here we are making some more leaves. Bashing them with the heat gun and creasing them to give them more of a 3D effect, so they're not as flat and uninteresting. Once the foam is done for both the skull and shoe toppers, it's time to start with the coating. Sealing the foam with diluted contact adhesive first, and then mixing up the UreCoat. My first impressions of using this stuff, as this is the first time I've ever used it, I wasn't a fan. Let's start off with the flaws. It's two-part. Therefore, you have to mix up a certain amount. If you don't use the amount that you mix up, you've lost it. In addition, it's got a very short pot life. The pot life is how long between when you mix the two parts to when it completely sets. I think this is roughly 5 to 10 minutes, which really isn't a very long time. It can be extended by adding white spirit, also known as turpentine, also known as mineral spirit, I believe, but you're still going to be rushing to paint it on. Latex, which is generally my favourite way to coat foam, you have all the time in the world. You can take your time, get it right, and you don't have to rush. On the other hand, UreCoat does coat thicker. It's nice and tough, it's very durable, but I found the need to rush made it difficult to focus on accuracy and doing a good job. I needed to be rushing as quickly as possible, and when I wanted to take time and get into nooks and crannies of a detailed piece of work, that was very difficult with the UreCoat. As I say, it's not a terrible product, it's just useful for specific jobs, I feel. I only used 2 coats of UreCoat before I was confident that it was thick enough. But because these 2 props weren't being used for LARP weapons, I didn't feel the need to make the coat as thick. If I was making a LARP weapon, I would still certainly use latex, because I'm not so sure how easy it is to mix acrylic paint into the UreCoat. Looking on the website, it did seem like there are pigments that could be added to the UreCoat, but being the cheap ass I am, I'm not going to spend extra money on paints that can only be used with one specific product. And since I'm not being sponsored to do this by Smooth On, I'm not going to waste any more money than I have to. I'd prefer something that could, like acrylic, be used for any purpose. The next step is painting. I wasn't really a fan of the painting process, to be honest. I started with a spray-on primer on the skull. It went on easy enough, but unfortunately after it had dried and I'd started putting on further layers of paint, it came off easily as well. I did some research and realised the best and probably only way of painting over UreCoat is to use a spray rattle can primer with a light coat. If anyone has any suggestions or has experience on other ways of coating it, I'd be very eager to hear them. Generally not a fan of using this sort of paint on flexible materials because paint tends to crack. But fortunately, I didn't find that much of a problem with these props. I think mostly because they weren't really flexing that much. Once the primer had been completed with the skull, I coated it in a watered down brown acrylic and then went to town dry brushing, lightly painting on layer after layer of white, off-white and yellowy bone colours to give the skull a fresh and dirty look. I think it came out particularly well. It came out quite matte. I did the same brown covering acrylic on the shoe toppers. And while it's difficult to see here, I added several layers of varying shades of brown because of the detail involved and all the nooks and crannies. It took some time to get the whole thing covered. Here I'm adding several layers of green to the ivy. Starting off with darker green and working brighter. To give them some depth. And once the painting is done, I prepared the elastic and Velcro, which was then hot glued to the piece. Overall, I have mixed feelings about UreCoat. Once on, it does create a tough coat, I won't deny that, but it doesn't like taking paint. I found that while you could paint over it, it could easily come off. And the fact that it was two parts, the hot glue didn't end up sticking at all well. I would advise possibly trying super glue or maybe even contact adhesive. But I haven't found anything I'm entirely satisfied with. But, well, there you go. That'll do.